When I was a boy, my world was playing in the playground with people called Steve or Debbie or Richard, and we played games about cowboys or about Martians. But where have they all gone? Gun-toting cowboys were clearly of its time, and those names have inexplicably fallen out of favour. But what of Martians? What happened to the mysteriously marvellous little green men from Mars? It was in 1877 that people first started to get excited about the prospect of life on the red planet, after Italian astronomer Giovanni Schiaparelli got a new powerful telescope and described the valleys and the channels he saw as canali. Alas, canali sounds like canals to the English ear, and that gave rise to the idea of artificially created waterways connecting the wet poles to the dry equatorial region created by the creatures living there. One such proponent of this idea was an American called Percival Lowell. You know how in history people can be brilliant in their field but make one mistake and that's the thing they're remembered for. For example, King Henry II. He was a brilliant king, a great ruler. He brought peace to England. He set down the legal framework which is still in place today. But he's remembered for killing Thomas Becket. A more up-to-date reference, Roberto Baggio. He was voted the 4th best footballer in the 20th century. He scored 24 goals, 27 goals for Italy. But he's best remembered for missing that one penalty in the 1994 World Cup final. Well, Percival Lowell was much the same. He was a brilliant man, brilliant mathematician, an extremely good businessman. He built an observatory in Arizona, which is where Pluto was discovered. The PL of Pluto is in his honour, Percival Lowell. Anyhow, he made one mistake, and his mistake was to be convinced that the canals on Mars were real. And he spent years of his life looking at it. He even wrote 3 books about it. As much as the idea of canals delighted the public, scientists were more sceptical. Nobody else could see these canals. No one knew what it was that Lowell was looking at. Now we think it might have even been the reflection of his own eye inside the telescope, or maybe even scratches on the lens. Also, in 1892, many people saw flashes of light coming from Mars and took it to mean signals being beamed down to us. We're not entirely sure what those flashes of light were, but it was probably just sunlight being reflected through the ice crystals in the atmosphere. The following year, 1893, the word Martian was used for the first time in a story, in Illyrial, or A Voyage to Other Worlds. And 2 years after that, in 1895, work began on the most famous of all books about Martians. H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's, except for Nikola Tesla, who detected rhythmic signals on his radio receiver, which he deduced must be sent from Mars. This led to a complete radio silence during a few days in August 1924, while scientists listened out for faint transmissions. They detected nothing. Science fiction was being written about Mars with very little science fact. Now, the first time the term little green men was used in a story was in 1946 in a book called Maya's Little Green Man. Interestingly, before then, little green man was a derogatory term used to denote smaller members of the Russian army. Curiously, there was one book that very nearly hit the mark spot on. Gulliver's Travels. In it, Gulliver speaks to the astronomers in Laputa, who discuss the 2 moons of Mars and mention their size and orbits, all of which 150 years before they were discovered. Aha! In the same way Mariner 2 dispelled all the fantastic ideas about life on Venus, Mariner 4 removed all hope of Martian civilization when it flew by Mars in 1964. It found no canals, no sign of life. But the yearn for idea of there being Martians lived on. 7 years before Mariner 4 ruined the fun, there was a story in the comic book Race to the Moon called Face on Mars, about the discovery of a giant Martian face on Mars. Unbelievably, in 1976, Viking 1 took photos of the surface of Mars and found this. Could it really be a human face built by an intelligent race of aliens? That wasn't the only potential sign of life. This is the Gala Crater, which looks like a huge smiley face. Of course, they're not made by aliens. This is an example of pareidolia, faces in the fire, if you like, where your brain finds faces in places where there aren't any. The face on Mars from another angle looks like this. It was the shadows that made it look so lifelike. There are a couple more really good examples, though. This is from the Mars Exploration Rover Spirit in 2007. Is it a person? And this from the Curiosity rover in 2013 looks amazingly like a rat. So there are no little green men on Mars. The nearest we'll come to a little green creature is Kermit the Frog. I wonder, if Kermit the Frog had come from Mars, do you think he would have left a great big picture of himself?